The servers never slept. That was the first thing you noticed when you walked into Vanguard Systems' data floor, the endless hum of vibration that crawled under your skin and stayed there. It wasn't noise, it was breathing, and for Aria Vale, it was the sound of purpose. At 29, Aria was one of those rare people whose mind ran faster than her ambition. A cybersecurity architect with a quiet obsession for symmetry and control, she had spent 5 years building Vanguard's Pulse, the Nexus Grid, a multi-layer defense system that guarded the data of governments, banks, and defense contractors. She wasn't flashy, wasn't political, she was the ghost behind the firewall. Her code didn't just protect data, it predicted attacks before they happened. And in a world where breaches meant billions, that made her priceless. Or so she thought. Every morning she arrived before dawn, sliding her keycard into the elevator while the rest of the city still yawned awake. She liked it that way. Empty halls, the scent of overworked servers, and the low buzz of fluorescent lights. Coffee in one hand, code window open in the other. This was her church. Vanguard was her cathedral. But like every cathedral, it had its priests, and one in particular had a god complex. Damian Cross, the new CEO, had been in charge for less than a year, and already people spoke his name like it came with a price tag. Ex-Google, venture darling. The kind of man who made you feel like you owed him something just by standing in his office. He was charming in the way a rattlesnake is graceful, quiet, smooth, and dangerous if you got too close. Aria stayed out of his way. She wasn't built for boardrooms or PR dinners. She built things, defended systems, and trusted her code more than any handshake. But over the last few months, something had shifted. The new leadership had begun rewriting contracts, moving teams, and reclassifying intellectual property. Every update came with a smile and a non-disclosure agreement. She didn't like the smell of it. Then came the incident. A midnight breach in Sector 9 classified servers housing government encryption keys. For the first time, the Nexus Grid failed. The alarms blared, systems scrambled, and millions of dollars in contracts went up in smoke. Aria spent 36 straight hours tracking the breach, only to discover that the attack didn't come from outside. It came from an internal relay, a hidden channel, approved under Damian's digital signature. When she brought the evidence to her supervisor, he avoided eye contact. "Aria," he said carefully, "you should probably let this go. Damian's involved." 2 days later, she was called into a meeting. Damian was there wearing that expensive smile. The HR director read from a paper she didn't need to. "Effective immediately, your employment with Vanguard Systems is terminated." No explanation, no hearing, just silence punctuated by the click of her access badge being deactivated. She looked at Damian one last time. He was smirking, hands folded like a man who'd already won. And that's when she said the words that would haunt him forever. "You just unplugged the wrong system." Aria didn't sleep the night she was fired. Not because of rage, because of rhythm. Her mind was still humming with the pulse of the servers she'd built. For 5 years, her heartbeat had been synced to the Nexus Grid. The silence in her apartment felt wrong, too, still too human. She sat in front of her laptop, the same one she'd coded half of Vanguard's system on, back when the company still felt like a dream. She stared at the login portal for hours. Her credentials were dead, her access revoked, but she wasn't locked out. Not really. She knew the architecture better than anyone. She had built the skeleton, wired its veins, and designed every heartbeat of the encryption system that powered the Nexus Grid. And she'd buried a failsafe inside it, something no one else knew existed. They called it heartbeat encryption, a self-generating checksum that used biological metrics as part of the algorithm. It was supposed to be symbolic, but Aria, ever the perfectionist, had added a fragment of her own neural signature to the key. Her digital fingerprint, undetectable, Unrepeatable. That meant one thing. No matter who sat in her chair now, the Nexus grid would always carry her pulse. At 2:17 a.m., she connected to an external sandbox, a hidden mirror she'd quietly maintained since year one. It was off the books, invisible to the company network. She called it Echo. On her screen, green lines flickered to life. Echo online. Last sync 62 days ago. She ran a trace. Every active server on Vanguard's network pinged back in milliseconds. They were still running her code, still breathing with her rhythm, and there, buried in the logs, was proof. The breach that got her fired hadn't been an attack. It was a trigger event manually executed from Damian Cross's personal key. He'd fabricated the entire incident to tank a government security audit and quietly shift the company's assets offshore before a merger. He'd used her name as the cover story. And now Vanguard was preparing to sell her entire system to a private defense contractor for $800 million. Arya leaned back in her chair, staring at the city lights bleeding through her blinds. It wasn't anger that filled her chest, it was a sharp, surgical clarity. She wasn't the victim, she was the architect, and architects always know how to bring down what they built. She spent the next 48 hours writing a sequence. It wasn't destructive. Arya wasn't interested in chaos. It was surgical, a command that would call back every node connected to her biometric signature. One whisper of code and the network would fold in on itself like lungs exhaling their final breath. When she finished, she uploaded it to a dormant access point, an innocuous subsystem tagged as Maintenance Queue 47. The same queue Damian had approved for his fake breach. It was elegant, poetic even. The same weapon he used to frame her would be the one that erased him. She looked at the timestamp on her screen. Thursday, 5:58 a.m., she whispered almost gently, "Let's see if you still remember my heartbeat," and pressed Run Simulation. The cursor blinked twice, then 3 words appeared. Command recognized. Awaiting activation. The network wasn't dead. It was waiting for her signal. For 3 days, Arya didn't move the activation file. She told herself she was testing, fine-tuning the code, ensuring the sequence would fold cleanly without triggering collateral failures. But deep down, she was hesitating. It wasn't fear of getting caught. It was something else, the weight of creation. She had built this network from nothing. Every node, every encrypted path, every line of predictive logic had her fingerprints on it. To kill it now would be like euthanizing something she had once loved. But every time she thought of walking away, she'd remember Damian's smirk and the way the HR director wouldn't meet her eyes. And how 5 years of loyalty had been traded for a single press release about internal performance failures. Still, Arya didn't want revenge, not in the petty cinematic sense. What she wanted was truth. She wanted the system to expose what really happened. She wanted Vanguard to feel the hollow silence of losing what it never respected. So she opened Echo again. The interface glowed softly, waiting for her command. She typed a single line, "Activate, dry run." The simulation unfolded like an orchestra in motion, servers blinking in sequence, data, rerouting loops, collapsing systems, folding inward like origami. And then silence. Perfect, symmetrical silence. It worked. Her chest rose, then fell. She sat there staring at the calm emptiness on her screen, realizing that if she pressed enter again for real this time, Vanguard Systems would lose everything. That's when her old team lead, Eli Park, called. She hadn't spoken to him since the firing. He sounded nervous. "Arya," he whispered. "Whatever you're doing, stop. Damian's been running audits. He knows someone's mirroring the network." Her heart skipped. He can't trace Echo. It's off-grid. Maybe. But listen, he's not just covering the breach anymore. He's selling the entire architecture to the defense board. The contract's already on the table. tomorrow he's presenting your work, your code, as his own. For a moment, Arya couldn't breathe. The final insult wasn't the firing. It was the theft, the erasure of her existence from the very thing she had built. "Thanks, Eli," she said quietly. "You did the right thing." He sighed. "What are you going to do?" She didn't answer. She just stared at the screen, at the blinking cursor, still waiting. Command recognized, awaiting activation. Arya leaned forward, eyes cold now. Every hesitation dissolved. She wasn't destroying a company, she was reclaiming her pulse. She entered the key phrase sync override, avail, confirm protocol Lazarus. The console froze for half a second, then a soft chime. Protocol armed. In that moment, Arya crossed the invisible line between employee and architect of consequences. By morning, Vanguard's entire network would be breathing through her code, waiting for her to decide whether it lived or died. She closed her laptop, turned off the light, and whispered into the darkness. "Tomorrow I pull the plug." The city was still half asleep when Arya woke up. Rain streaked down her window, the kind that turns streetlights into smudged halos. She brewed coffee out of habit, not need. Her adrenaline had already replaced sleep. By 6 a.m., she was seated at her desk, laptop open, Echo glowing in soft amber light. The cursor blinked steadily on the command line, a silent pulse matching her own heartbeat. Command ready, awaiting confirmation. Her hand hovered over the keyboard. She took a long, steady breath. This wasn't vengeance anymore. It was symmetry. They had stolen her voice, her work, her future. Today, she would take back the one thing she still owned control. She entered the key. Execute, Lazarus. For a moment, nothing happened. Then Echo's diagnostics began to hum, a deep, rhythmic pulse that felt alive. One by one, the servers across Vanguard's $800 million network began to sync. To anyone watching it would look like routine maintenance, but Arya knew better. At 6:12 a.m., the first anomaly appeared. The backup servers started looping, redirecting power cycles in patterns no human operator could override. By 6:18, the global control dashboard went dark. Inside Vanguard Systems headquarters, alarms began to chirp softly at first, then louder, more insistent. Engineers rushed to terminals, calling out numbers that made no sense. Core latency's spiking failover isn't responding. Why is the East Cluster reading offline? Arya watched it all from her encrypted remote access window. Every command Damien's team attempted was met with silence or, worse, automated counter-responses. She designed Echo not just to build, but to protect, to learn, to adapt. And now Echo was doing what it was meant to do, rejecting corruption, purging unauthorized control, cleansing itself of greed. At 6:24, Damien appeared on the security feed, hair disheveled, shouting into a phone. Pull the damn plug, shut it down manually. But they couldn't. The system's physical overrides were already looped into Echo's defense protocols. Every command they issued only deepened the lockdown. Arya leaned closer to the screen. For a moment, she saw his face, the disbelief, the panic, the dawning realization that he'd lost everything. And then, at 6:27 a.m., the message she'd been waiting for appeared, Lazarus sequence complete, network integrity reset to origin state. Every node in Vanguard's system blinked once, then went silent. No explosions, no dramatic power surge, just quiet. Clean, irreversible quiet. The $800 million infrastructure gone. Every proprietary algorithm Damien had claimed credit for, deleted. Every stolen patent, every falsified record erased like it had never existed. Echo had executed her will, perfectly surgical, discreet, final. Arya closed her laptop, exhaling for the first time in what felt like years. Her hands trembled, but her expression was calm, almost serene. She whispered, "Goodbye, Vanguard." Outside, the rain had stopped. The first light of morning cut through the clouds, soft and golden, touching the edges of her desk. For the first time in years, she felt free, untethered from the machine she'd built and the empire that tried to own it. Across town, the boardroom at Vanguard Systems descended into chaos. Servers dead, contracts nullified, investors in meltdown. Damien stood alone at the head of the table, staring at the blank monitors that had once symbolized his control. He didn't know it yet, but his empire hadn't been attacked. It had been reclaimed by the woman who built it. The sun hadn't yet risen when the first alert blared across the company's internal systems. By 4 to 12 a.m., every regional server hub was dark. By 5 in Osiris, the executive suite was a war room of panic. And by 6:07, Claire Vasquez, former lead systems architect of Novanet, was already gone. From a motel room off Highway 1, she sat cross-legged on the bed, watching the chaos unfold on a muted news broadcast. The anchor's voice trembled as she read the breaking headline, "Massive outage cripples Novanet's global infrastructure $800 million system offline overnight." Claire took a slow sip of coffee, her hand steady for the first time in months. She didn't smile, she didn't gloat, she just exhaled. The night before, she'd stood in front of the glowing core servers, the same machines she'd helped design from the ground up. For years, she'd believed in what Novanet stood for: connection, progress, digital trust. But when she uncovered that the new neural integration protocol wasn't just mapping user behavior, it was harvesting biometric and cognitive data for private military contractors, something inside her broke. The moment she confronted CEO Vincent Cross, he'd looked at her like she was naive. "You think the world runs on idealism, Claire," he said, leaning across the glass table. "It runs on leverage. We just built the future of control." That's when she knew. There was no fixing it from within. So she'd written one last line of code, an invisible strand woven into the heart of Novanet's security AI. It didn't destroy data, it didn't steal money, it simply disconnected. At 2:13 a.m., the AI executed its silent directive. Every tether, every link, every surveillance module, gone. Now as the news cycled through words like catastrophic, irreversible, unprecedented, Claire sat in the quiet aftermath, realizing how strangely peaceful the silence felt. Outside the motel parking lot shimmered with morning fog. Her phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. "You really did it. They're calling it the digital blackout. You're free. R." She stared at the message for a long moment before deleting it. Freedom wasn't what she felt, not yet. She knew Novanet's reach went far beyond what the headlines could touch. They'd rebuild. They'd come for her. But for now, the world was offline, at least their world, and for the first time in years, the hum in her head was gone. No notifications, no pings, no systems to maintain, just stillness. Claire walked outside, letting the wind whip through her hair. The sky was pale blue, the kind that promised a sunrise, but hadn't yet delivered one. She thought of the millions of users who would wake up to blank screens, confused but safe at least for now. She had pulled the plug. And maybe she had saved something worth keeping. By the time the sun finally lifted over the California coast, Claire was already miles away from the motel. She drove south her old Jeep, humming down the empty highway, the ocean glinting like shards of glass beside her. The world was still in digital shock networks, silent screens, black governments scrambling to assess the damage. For the first time in years, no one could track her. No GPS, no metadata trail, just wind salt and the faint smell of diesel. Freedom had a strange taste, part guilt, part relief. At a diner outside Monterey, the radio crackled through snippets of chaos. Novanet confirms massive data loss. CEO Vincent Cross has resigned pending investigation. Experts estimate global losses in the billions. Claire stirred her coffee slowly. Around her life went on. A trucker laughed at the counter. A teenage couple shared pancakes. The waitress hummed to an old Eagles song. Nobody recognized her. Nobody would. She thought of the millions of users who had trusted Novanet to guard their privacy, their families, their digital lives. She'd seen what the neural system was doing, how it mapped not just what people did, but who they were becoming. Every heartbeat, every emotional pattern, every impulse cataloged for control. That wasn't connection. That was possession. Pulling the plug hadn't been revenge, it had been mercy. For them, and maybe for herself. Claire slipped a small black flash drive from her pocket, the only surviving fragment of her code. She'd erased everything else but this. This was a seed, a clean system, one that couldn't be bought corrupted or turned into a weapon. She left a $100 bill under her coffee cup, walked out to the cliffs, and watched the ocean crash against the rocks. The wind was fierce, tearing at her jacket, but she didn't flinch. She pulled the flash drive from her hand, looked at it one last time, then threw it into the waves. It vanished instantly, swallowed by the Pacific. For a long while, she just stood there, breathing in the salt and silence. No servers humming, no lights blinking, no one to command or control. Somewhere out there, the world was rebooting leaders, scrambling engineers, rebuilding users, learning what it meant to be offline again. Maybe that was the only way forward to start over untethered. Claire turned toward the horizon, the sunlight catching in her red hair. Her phone burner number 3 buzzed once. A single message appeared. "You can't erase everything, Claire. You know that." She read it, smiled faintly, and powered the phone off. Then she dropped it into the sand and walked away. As she disappeared down the coastal trail, the tide began to rise, swallowing the last trace of her footprints. For the first time in years, Claire didn't feel like part of a system. She felt human. And somewhere in the quiet spaces between broken networks and new beginnings, the world began to breathe again.